And then Antu Hakim means you are wise, which means you become wise. The very Orin Sof humbles itself to become wise. And we say the place you find Hashem's greatness is really the place you find His humility. So the fact that you can even call Him great or wise in this case is only because He's humbled Himself infinitely and contracted the infinite into becoming a finite thing. And this is the whole metaphor we've been using about the body. Like the soul sort of becomes one with its body, and suddenly the infinite God can be described, which is the big miracle. So that's Antu Hakim. But nonetheless, it's still Antu Hakim v'lo b'chokhma yediyah. It's still not a knowable chokhmah. Because compared to the chokhmah of the created worlds, sort of like the chokhmah of creation, still that level where Hashem has contracted Himself into Atzilut to become Hakim is b'chlal not known. Right? It's still it's an unknowable chokhmah. Because the tzimtzum that's yet coming, in order to go from Atzilus to Bri Yitzir Nasiya, Biyah Chokhmah, is Ein Aruch, is completely incomparable. And we gave some analogies to that yesterday to sort of just sharpen up the vastness of difference between them. We're going to speak more about that inside now, today. And we left off with a little analogy. And he says like this, we'll take it from 4 lines from the bottom of that second column. It's at the period there. Hine ha'inyan yuvan. Need one of these? 4 lines from the bottom. Ha'inyan yuvan al derech mashal. We can understand this by way of analogy. V'masha amar Razal. This that the sages said, Ein lecha kol esev. You have no grass that grows from below. She'ein lo mazel. That doesn't have a mazel over it, and strikes it and tells it to grow, right? In other words, there's no such thing as just a physical entity which doesn't have a whole realm of seder ishtalshlus, as he says here, gavoa ma'al gavoa, one level upon the other level upon the other level, which is its spiritual source, right? The grass doesn't just really come something from nothing, as we say. It has a spiritual grass which is above it, and that has a spiritual grass which is above it. And every world, for infinite worlds, in order for it to get down to a blade of grass, there has to be an infinite level of hishtalshalus, of chain-like levels of divine energy, in order to make such a small level of energy go into a piece of grass, right? So it's not what you see. So he says, now let's look at this. Harei tapuach hagashmi, right? Take an apple, a physical apple. Yesh bo matikas, it has sweetness, right? In other words, you bite it and it's sweet. V'cheich ochel itam, and the palate that eats it can taste it, right? It has a palpable taste that you can actually feel with your body. Ha'im nomar sheyesh b'koach hatzomeach asher ba'aretz tam umatikos gamkein. So are we supposed to think, based on what we just said a moment ago, that everything has a spiritual source, and it doesn't just get here by itself, but rather it has like sort of an angelic level of, the blade of grass, or in this case the apple. And not just the apple, but everything about the apple, the color of the apple, the size of the apple, the sweetness of the apple. So are you trying to tell me then that there is in the power of growth in the earth, right? Tam umatikos, a taste and sweetness as well? In other words, the potential, the place that provides the energy for the sweetness of the apple, right? The source of that, is it also sweet, right? Is there such a thing as physical taste of sweetness in the potential realm of energy from where this sweetness of the physical apple comes from? That's the question at hand. You understand what I'm trying to say? No?
It's all sweet.
No, in other words, sweetness is a physical sensation, right?
Okay.
And we know that everything that happens in this world is already in a pre-state, in a potential state, in so to speak, the world above it, or a dimension before it. Before it comes into existence here, it already exists in a dimension somewhere else, and a dimension above that, and a dimension above that, all at higher and higher levels. So if it comes out sweet here in this world, I can taste an apple. Does that mean there's something called the sweet physical taste of this apple in its previous status before it comes into the physical world? That's what he's asking.
There's taste in the higher world.
Let's say there has to be taste. If there's taste here, there's taste there. But can we really compare the Indian of taste?
Right. Okay.
Because here's a physical taste that your palate can experience, right? And so the whole idea of just like becoming physical, he's trying to zero us in on the complete incomparability of what it means to jump from one world to the other, right? Especially into Gashmias. So in other words, everything comes from the previous world, but is it in any way similar to what it looks like when it comes into this world? He's saying it's kind of ridiculous. In other words, there's a power of growth in the earth, right? Just simply put, where does the apple come from? That's how he sort of switches it from the spiritual realm to something a little bit more closer to our senses, but not really. There's a power of growth in the ground, right? In other words, the ground, if you think about it, has some kind of mystical power that all other entities which are not the ground do not have, because the ground kind of produces something from nothing, right? You put a seed in the ground and all of a sudden you have almost an apple tree, leaves and bark, and all kinds of entities of physicality that you didn't have before. It just produces it from nothing. So the idea is that it not only can it produce an apple tree, it can produce a pear tree, it can produce it can produce so many different species and so forth. And so all this is potentially inside the ground. The earth is the lowest level. If you say we have man, animal, plant, and earth, right? In general, earth is like Malchus, it's the lowest level. But we know that inside the lowest levels contain the highest level. And therefore the power of Hashem's essence to sort of create something yesh ma'ayin, it gets lodged into the very lowest place. As they say, na'utz t'chilasan basofan, the beginning is wedged in the end. So there's a certain koach that's found in the lowest place, which all the other entities in the higher realms above it do not possess, and that's this ability to create something from nothing, right? So inside the earth, there are apples, there are pears, there are watermelons, right? There's all this stuff. I mean, but obviously there's not like a bunch of watermelons sitting in the earth. It's just the power of it. So what he's saying here is in that potential power, it's like a spiritual energy inside the earth. Does it have the sweetness of an apple? It obviously has the potential koach of the energy of that apple. It doesn't come from nowhere, right? But is it in any way comparable? That's his question. You follow? Let's go on a little bit. Maybe we'll clarify more. He says, Pshita b'mazel she'enu me'erech ha'muhu zeh klal. So he answers your question. He says it's obvious that in the mazel, which is that angel, so to speak, from above it, which is tapping it and telling it to grow, or the spiritual power in the earth, which has the potential of this thing before it comes into a physical entity, it's obvious that it's in no way comparable whatsoever to the thing which it produces.
Wait, it's either a spiritual power in the earth or it's an angel tapping.
There's kind of the same thing, right? In other words, I would say that there's infinite levels. So I mean, there's angels upon angels upon angels upon angels. Eventually, it goes into a physical koach in the earth, but that's still a step away from it actually becoming an apple in your hand, right? So if you want to say that in other words, what all he's trying to get to is its source material, how this apple exists in its source, right? So we could talk about the angelic source of the apple. We could talk about closer the sort of physical power in the earth that's about to produce an apple. Still, neither of them have sweetness, a physical sweetness to the mouth, at least sweetness to the palate. It's ridiculous to think that they do. They're not physical yet. They haven't come into our realm, and so it's not shy to say you could taste such a thing, right? And it doesn't have taste.
Could it be that the sweetness comes from the tiferet or something as it's all filtering down into the malchut of the earth?
Very good, but the point is, can you taste tiferet?
But that's what I'm saying. Tiferet is beauty, so beauty can manifest itself in taste, color, all these beautiful different ways.
But it manifests itself as, I would say, is the most important thing you said there. Yeah, when it manifests itself as an apple, you can taste it. Right. But can you taste tiferet?
No.
That's right. No. You cannot taste tiferet. That's what he's trying to say. Pshita b'mazel she'enu me'erech ha'muhu zeh klal. It's obvious that the mazel of the thing, so to speak, the spiritual energy of the thing, it doesn't have that type of taste, right? Ella ha'inyan hu. So how does it work here? So Mazel tov, we're switching the pages here, on the next page. So So very sweet. So the Indian is Shamatikos Nimshach Mechesed. You were pretty close there, I must say, Yoshua. Good answer. He says the sweetness comes from Chesed. In other words, as opposed to Tiferes, but there's other things that come from Tiferes. The point is that they come from the Sephardic dimension, but nonetheless they don't have taste. Right? The sweetness is Nimshach Mechesed Umeriru Megevora, and bitterness comes from Gevora. Barehem Inyanim Ruchnim. Right? They are spiritual things. Gevura and Chesed are not. You won't go to the 5 and dime shop and I'd like to purchase some Gevura and Chesed, please. Right? You can't find that over here. Right? It's a spiritual thing.
You can get them in Swap. When Mashiach comes, you can do that, right?
You can get it from our wives, you can get Gevura from our wives, and Chesed from ourselves.
Right? Okay. Right. That's you guys. Those are two very, very good answers to that question. But anyway, let's just go back to the Sefer here. So Gevura creates bitterness, and Chesed creates sweetness. Right? They're not physical things; they're spiritual things. You can't taste them. It's just that through the shtalshalus, the chain-like descent of the world, and the order of the declining levels after level, madrega achar madrega nizgashmu ad shenimshach b'chinas chesed matiko. So it becomes eventually like it goes from one level of chesed to a lower level of chesed. Like we were talking about before, there's chokhmah that's not known, and then there's first we said there's chokhmah inside of the Orin Sof, right? And then that chokhmah comes out and manifests itself as Atzilut, and it's completely different as to what it looks like just before. And then there's chokhmah that comes into bria, and there's chokhmah that comes to Yetzira and Asi, and finally there's chokhmah that comes into a human mind, right? So he's saying there's many levels of descending levels of wisdom, or chesed in this case, that are coming down through the Seder Yishtalshlus. Each one is sort of completely incomparable to what comes before it. And he says the same thing is true with physical taste. He's giving us an analogy of that. I'm already bringing in the analog. He's saying just like sweetness, it really comes from chesed. But if chesed is going to go down a whole chain of different levels of chesed, eventually it will actually materialize itself as a physical thing. And that move from going from spiritual chesed to physical chesed is probably the most dramatic of all of them that there can possibly be. Dramatic, like as the fact that this is apples and this is oranges, and it's so incomparable and so impossible to see any link between them, because it's one thing to go from chesed of bria to yetzira. It's a major thing, and you've completely transformed the nature of the chesed. But at least it's still spiritual. They're one spiritual to another spiritual. But to go from spiritual to physical, not only have you gone down like a world, but you've transformed the very material of the world into a completely foreign entity that it's impossible to even recognize that this has anything to do with its source.
So when they see that Avram had like pure hesed, is it still not comparable?
Yeah, there's actually, you bring up there's an important perek in Tanya that talks about something that we read just a couple days ago. Avram says, Anochi afer ve'efer, efer ve'afer. Which was it? I don't remember. But he says, I am mere dust and ashes. Right? So Rashi says he's dust because he was meant to be turned into dust in the oven. He's ashes because he was meant to be, killed by what's that?
By the kings.
Yeah, by the kings. But the idea is that in the Tanya it says, what does he really mean? And again, it's a little bit of a diversion from the Mimer, but it's pretty much the answer to your question is not that far off exactly what we're saying. He says that everyone knows that Avram was a Merkava, a chariot of Chesed of Atzilus, right? To the point that Chesed of Atzilus said to Hashem, you don't even need me anymore while Avram was in the world. He was like a manifestation of Chesed Mamish. Nonetheless, you might think that there was some comparison between Chesed of Atzilus Mamish to Avram Avinu. Therefore, Avram Avinu comes and says, favors from the Chumash, I'm that dust and ashes. What is dust and ashes? So just like if you'd have a tree, right, which is basically this beautiful entity where it is a compound of 4 elements: fire, earth, water, and air, because inside of every entity they have all 4. And it's beautiful and it has fruits and it's just like this gorgeous thing to look at. It's like a wholesome, healthy tree. So that would be like the chesed of Atzilus. And what Avram was saying is that I'm like a mamish I am dust and ashes compared to that tree. In other words, it's impossible to say that there's no relationship to us whatsoever. But if you would remove the fire, the earth, and the water, the wind and the water from the tree, and you just break it down to its most basic element, right? Which is it's yesod ha'afar. It's the element of earth in it. So, and you would remove all the others. What would it look like? A bunch of ashes, a coal, right? So he says that's Avram Avinu compared to a tree. Can you really say that Avram Avinu was a merkava of Chesed of Atzilus, that he and Chesed of Atzilus looked like the same thing? Only if you compare a beautiful tree, you can't, to a pile of ashes. So yeah, that's what Avram was. So it's very similar to what we're saying. He was somewhat similar, like he had like sort of the concentrated essence of that particular sphera, but comparatively, it was like ashes compared to a tree. It's the same thing. Whenever you come into this world, you wind up completely, transforming what it was in its potential. What the sweetness of the chesed was to what the sweetness of an apple is basically unidentifiable. They're so different. So that's what he's saying here.
Are you sure he wasn't saying to be humble or to
I'm pretty sure the Alter Rebbe was saying that.
Oh,
yeah. I mean, he was also humble, but okay. Anyway, so going on, 3 lines down, so he says that really the chesed comes down to this whole seder ishtalshus and becomes physical sweetness, and even though there's no comparison whatsoever between them, mikol makom hu mizgo t'chunaso, it's still from its same mixture, its same sort of content. In other words, it's not completely unrelated, but like I said, it's like dust and ashes compared to a tree. I mean, it has that same sort of foundation, but all the sort of wholeness and the beauty of it and its full expression, you don't see anymore when it comes down to the physical. And he says, I'll give you sort of a little hint as to what it means to sort of go down levels in sweetness and in pleasantness spiritually. Just to give us, we don't really know what it means to go from Bria to Yetzira in Chesed. It's a little bit beyond our pay grade, but we can still understand by way of analogy going from level to level to level in sweetness. It's regarding physical things. He says, "Kamo tainug shel davar chochma." There's the idea of the sweetness, the enjoyment of a physical, of a davar chochma, of an idea, right? That really, when you get your hands on, so to speak, your brain on a wonderful new concept that you never heard before, literally nothing makes you more satisfied and happy than that, right? And so there's a certain pleasure. It's like a real, true pleasure in understanding something. It makes you happy, and you're like all of a sudden very content. Gam kain metikos. It's also called sweet, right? People say that's a sweet idea. Do they or do they not? Right? V'kain tainug shel nigun. It's a sweet song, right? That's a really nice, pleasant song, right? The idea is that there's a tainug of a nigun, which is certainly has the same pleasure sensors are touched, but you kind of can't compare the sweetness of a nigun to the sweetness of an idea. It's already going down a level. Hu mina kol hayotze min halev. Or obviously, some people who are not necessarily so familiar with tasting the sweetness of an idea will agree. But the truth is that tasting the sweetness of an idea is simply more pleasurable than tasting the sweetness of a pretty song.
Meaning that tasting is better than not better, just like more.
No, they're both called tasting. The idea is that here one is dealing with the intellect, right? Finding the pleasure inside the intellect. One is finding the pleasures we'll see inside of the midos. Like what's beautiful about a song is it makes you feel happy, right? It feels sweet in a certain sense. So that's called the midos. Again, there's, I'm a music lover as well, but the truth is, and you can find a lot of pleasure in music, but it's officially, and if you think about it as well, it's in comparison to the type of pleasure that you can feel from truly grasping an idea, because it's not as coarse, it's not as loud, so it might not, the feeling might be a little bit more sensitive, but it's a more refined, higher taste, right?
Could you maybe say that it's a sweetness in the Bria versus a sweetness in the Yetzira?
That's what we're doing. We're going down in, right. So in other words, the sweetness in the Yetzira it might be more obvious to us
Right,
because it's
easier
closer to us,
for sure.
but it's less great in its essentially.
It's a higher pleasure.
It's a higher form of pleasure. So there's the niggin, sweetness, which comes from the kol hayotzim min halev, which comes from the voice. How do you know it comes from the midos? Because physically speaking, a song comes from your voice, and your voice comes from your heart. Right? The idea of the breath, it actually is generated from the heart. So that's where the home of the midos. L'chein b'kama yuridos, and so he says when he goes to many descents. Vishtalshlus, naisametikos gashmi mamish. That same thing that you taste in your mouth is hitting the sort of the same pleasure sensor in a certain way as a sweet niggin or a sweet idea. It's just you obviously can compare like a nice ice cream to a beautiful idea that you just like understood God, right? On the other hand, they're both called sweet. They're both called pleasure. They both tap into the same thing, but it's like a hishtalshlus of events that it's almost incomparable to say that this and this have what to do with each other, but they do have some kind of common core. They're made out of the same sphera. It's just that the sphera goes through unbelievable cataclysmic changes in order to become a sweet idea to a sweet taste. Right? And this is the idea. Hagam shehefresh v'hevdel rav b'nei. Even though they're so different, they're still one is a hishtalshlus from another. They're still called chesed. It's just dust and ashes compared to the chesed which is found inside the tree, as we said in the analogy. So all that little road there was an analogy to explain what we started yesterday and at the beginning of this class about chokhmah. We're talking about antu chakim v'lo b'chokhmah yadi. We're trying to understand how Hashem put himself into spheros. And we're saying that really he manifested himself from a oneness and he created himself as a chokhmah in the world of Atzilus. And then that went further into the Chokhmah, the world of Bria, and so forth. So from this, that we said, we can understand that so it is with the Chokhmah, sheyesh ba gam ken gavoa ma'al gavoa. Right? It has these levels of higher and higher and higher and higher dimensions of wisdom. Like we said, even in the physical world, right? The stars above, as the Rambam says, and I love to say it because it's so radical, they are aware of themselves and they're aware of us. Right? The actual planets and the stars. Right, so in other words, their ability to perceive is vast, much more vast than human intellect. Right, and they're still physical entities. Right, imagine the sun, the size of it even shows you sort of like what's cooking over there. It's almost a conscious entity. It's aware of itself and it's aware of us, and it's just a physical entity. And apparently the sun is just a small star. Right, and let alone this is just all in the physical realm. And there's infinite levels of spiritual realms, and each one has entities of intellect, which we just can't even possibly fathom what it means to think like that. And this is what it means, gavoa ma'al gavoa. It goes higher and higher and higher in the ability to perceive godliness. V'hinei hagam sha'chochma b'debriya einu me'erech v'lo mahus chochma hanir v'niglas b'asiya. Even though the chochma in the world of Bria is not in any way comparable, and it's not of the same mahus, the same identity of the chokhmah which appears and is revealed to us in the world of Asiya, like what we call chokhmah, right? The chokhmah of Bria is really like in no way compared to it. Makom hu makar v'shurash lios mimenu his habus b'chinas chokhmah d'Asiya niglas. Nonetheless, it's the source and the root from which it comes out the existence of the Chachma that appears to us in Asiya. In other words, you can't have the dust and ashes unless you have the tree first, right? It's the source material.
The essence.
It's the essence. I mean, the essence. Yeah. In other words, if there wasn't such a thing as the Chachma, a higher version of Chachma, then we could never experience a lower version of Chachma, right?
The first
I mean, we're talking about the Chachma Bria, so it's not the first Chachma, right? Kachi Chachma d'Atzilus. The same is true with the Chachma d'Atzilus. Ima yoshehu b'chinas chakim v'lo b'chachma yadiyah. Even though we said regarding the Chachma d'Atzilus that it's an unknowable Chachma, right? It stands alone from all the Chachmas in all the lower worlds, what we call Bia. Because why? It's still God's Chachma. It hasn't taken itself into the form of being Chokhmah of the creation, even the highest versions of creation. Nonetheless, it still has this quality of being the source, right? If Hashem didn't come down into a godly chokhmah, there would be no way for there to be such a thing as a worldly or a created chokhmah. So even though they're incomparable, this is a chokhmah and not a knowable chokhmah, it still is the source in some way of all the lower chokhmahs of the world. Mikol makom, nevertheless, he is makar de makar. It's at least a source of a source. In other words, if you want to say that Bria is the source of our chokhmah, because Bria is really the source of chokhmah in the creation, so this is the source of the source, right? So we really have, it's Atzilus, it's not the source of our chokhmah. Atzilus, but it's the source of our chokhmah, right? And when something is the source of the source, you know, then it's basically, you can't even say that's where I come from, because you don't really come from there. You come from your source, right? So it's very, very, very foreign concept to even imagine what it means, the chokhmah of God. We can't even figure out the chokhmah of a star, and that's even physical, and we're talking about the chokhmah of Bria.
Well, some of the knowledge so we're from Abraham is our father, but that source is so far away, it's hard to envision that. It's related analogous to that, right? Now, we have many, many grandparents before Abraham, but we're still the source. Our source is from Abraham, and his source is from Hashem.
Okay, I mean, I would still say that it's somewhat. You could trace it back. You know, I would call that almost by definition the Seder Hishtalshlus, right? Because one thing is joined to the other, literally, like someone's mother, somebody's going back to you. So there is like a reasonable chain. But the idea that Abraham himself, let's say, was a manifestation of Hashem's chesed in the world. Like, where did he come from the beginning? In other words, there's a jump that you can't even imagine how that's your source, right? So Abraham is our source, let's say, from Bria to a Yetzirah to a Siyah. Okay, I can understand. It's far from me, but it's at least a link. But from Atzilus, it's like it's an incomparable state of affairs. I don't see in any way how that's my source. So I can't even call it my source. I have to call it the source of my source.
Right, there's a sort of portal, if you will, where the light energy of that has to go through something
very dramatic.
Right, which is a disconnect in terms of our understanding of the physical world, of how we see it. But once we're here, then you can go up to Abraham.
So it's like in Star Trek or Star Wars, when they push the button, they go through galaxies.
Something like that.
Do you mean there's the source of the source refers to
Atzilus.
Atzilus and Bria? Or
Atzilus. Bria is the source.
Bria is the source.
Because Bria is already a wisdom of the... Bria means creation, right?
Yeah.
So once Hashem has already put something called Chokhmah into the Bria, into the creation, so that anything else in the entire creation that has Chokhmah, it's getting its Chokhmah from the source of Chokhmah in creation, which is the Chokhmah of Bria. But that which is beyond creation, anything in creation cannot call that level of Chokhmah their source, because it's not their source. Their source is from Chokhmah of Bria. So they have to call it the source of their source, because it's not clear really how the Chokhmah of Bria even comes into existence from the Chokhmah of Atzilus. There's what is it called? Chokhmah of Atzilus is called a Chakim v'lo b'Chokhmah Yedua. It's called wisdom without not a knowable wisdom. I.e., it's not knowable to the creation, any levels of the creation, what Chokhmah there looks like. And so if we're going to call it our source, you can only call it the source of the source.
But Hashem is even higher than Atzilus, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, but Hashem unifies with Atzilus, which is the whole kind of many hours of conversation that we had together in the previous classes, that even though it's only a body, right, which is you can't compare the body to the soul, but the body fuses with the soul. So in Atzilus, it is Hashem there. You're right, the true Hashem, which is beyond his body. It has no spheros at all. It has no description whatsoever.
So you're saying Atzilus is the body, and Hashem is the nefesh within Atzilus, just as in the human realm.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, in the body, it gets a little bit more complicated than that, because
the body allows us to reveal the light of our own soul nefesh. The Atzilus allows the light of Hashem to be revealed through creation.
Yeah, but it gets a little bit more complicated than that. In as much as something we already discussed, just to remind you, is that the parts of Hashem that go into that body is still not the very essence of Hashem, if you recall, because only the theoretical spheros that are inside of Hashem, that are shaykh to the zulas, as we say, that are relevant to the other, they're the parts that actually go into the body. And that's why Beryl had the question yesterday, like, do we ever get to interact with the true Hashem? Because even in Atzilus, which is the source of our source, it only has, so to speak, the external aspects of Hashem in there, the parts that can fit into a body. The parts that can't fit into a body don't go into that body, seemingly.
Right, just like if you would say, can we ever interact with each other? We're interacting with each other's bodies and whatever, but the souls never.
Well, again, I will say the same thing I just said to you before. We are interacting with each other's souls, because if I was interacting with just your body, chas v'shalom, it would be a one-way conversation, right? So your soul's in your body. But again, what part of your soul is in your body? Only the part of your soul which is relevant to going into the body, not the essence of the soul.
Right.
Right.
The shoe, if you will.
Right. The shoe of the soul.
When we say Bria, it refers to like our creation as
The world of,
the physical.
no, here we've been referring to the world of Bria, which is
The shoe,
several,
just the shoe of the soul.
The third one?
the second world.
second world.
Atzilut. Well, it depends if you're going from
Soul's
below
up
to
there.
above. But it's the
Shoe's
second
down
world
here in the
down.
body.
So the creation after that.
It's Atzilus, Bria, Yitzir, and
Yeah,
Asiya.
you said this is our source, right?
Yeah, that's so that right.
That's
It's,
all
even
the
though it's
things.
very very spiritual, because it's not Bechlal, far away from this world of Asiya, but nonetheless we can still call that the source.
Which is the second one we're talking about.
Bria, we can still call the source, right? Because even though it's a mystical, spiritual place where this doesn't look anything like this, at least it's part of creation.
Okay.
Right.
Let's do this not part of
Atzilus is not part of creation.
Was there before creation?
I don't know if you want to get into. Yeah, it was there before creation because the creation is by definition Bria, which came after it, right? So it's something happening in God Himself. It's not part. In other words, what I mean is there before creation. When the whole world of Bria, there's no such thing as you and me. It's either God by Himself or God by Himself in the form of a man. But He's still by Himself, and He's not. And there's no other there. It's just Hashem. Atzilus. Atzilus is a manifestation of God as a somewhat finite entity, right? But it's not something other than God. There's no creation yet. The creation can only come out. This is actually kind of narrowed in on the exact point he's trying to make here. The creation can only come about when Hashem already narrows Himself into the form of a man, of some sort of a spiritual entity, man type of thing. Not to misread that. And then, because He has arms and legs, so to speak, He can create something. When He's in His mufshat, undressed state, it's not relevant for Him to make something because He doesn't have like
With which to make it.
what with to make it from. He doesn't have a head. He doesn't have so what's the creation going to be made out of? What's it going to look like? It's not going to be made with wisdom, and it's not going to be made with feeling, and it's not going to be made with thought, speech, and action because He doesn't have those things yet. So He has to. That's what He's trying to say. He has to first come down into some kind of a form in order to create something that has form. So Atzilus is this. That's why you can't really call Atzilus you can only call it the source of the source. Because even when He finally does create something, what He creates is the beginning of creation, which is infinitely far away from us. We're at the end of creation. So when He finally creates the creation, we can say, oh, that creation is the source of us. That's called, created wisdom. And even though it's infinite leagues beyond us, at least it's the source of created wisdom in the world of Asiya. But beyond that, it's not created wisdom. It's the wisdom of God. So it's only the source of the source. You follow that?
Yeah, and when we said that because it's the source of the Chokhmah, right? We're talking about the Chokhmah in Asiya?
Yeah.
Are we talking about the Chokhmah in Asiya? Or
We're talking about a lot of things. You have to probably be a little bit more specific than that.
So,
I don't know what you mean. Please ask your question, but I don't know what you're...
We said that it's the source of our Chokhmah.
What is the source of our Chachma? Bria is the source of... It's the source of our Chachma and our... Like your Chachma and my Chachma. But it's also the source of every level of Chachma in the entire Hishtalshlus that's below it. Hishtalshlus means all the worlds. In other words, let's say there's infinite worlds from Bria until here, which there are. Every one of them has dimensions of perceiving God and wisdom. They all come from the Chokhmah of Bria, including right down into the Chokhmah of an ant. Right? There's Chokhmah in an ant. Right? It has some type of intelligence going on there. Clearly, it gets it from the Chokhmah of Bria originally.
But Bria is source of the source of Atzilus.
No,
and
Atzilus is the source of the source.
And Bria is...
The source.
So each species have their own spirit?
Each species is certainly... There's all you're made up with is spheros. You're some kind of a combination of spheros, right? Right?
Is there more dominant ones between each person?
Yeah, every single one of us is dominated by a particular sphere, which makes us, so to speak, more on the level of chesed, or more on the level of gevura. There's 7 branches of the menorah, which means that there's 7 basic different types of Jews. That sphere in you is dominant. All right, let's go on, and let's have another question. You have a question?
well, I have some physical muscles to sort of help with the Chokhmah of Bria that I wanted to.
Okay.
Okay. So we know that everything is basically empty space, like 99.9% of everything in this physical world is just empty space. If we reduce it down to its, if we're using science, the atomic level, then in fact every atom is 99% empty, right? Everybody sort of know this basic amount of science,
right?
Right?
If you squish it down, it gets like great.
And then it's really just an electron, circulates, orbiting around a proton or whatever, and that. So the chokhmah of Bria, a way that you might be able to start to understand this is first, so forget that for a second, we come back to the physical world that we know, right? In order to make this bookshelf right here, first there has to be a tree, right? And then the tree is chopped up, and then there's an intelligence, the human, the machshava to cut it, and then the dibur and the ma'aseh to make this bookshelf. But first there has to be a tree. So in order for there to be anything, first there has to be something. And so the space, all of this is just empty space. It looks like us and a table, and it looks like stones, and it looks like a wall. But all of this is really just 99.99999% empty space. But the chokhmah of essence, of being, is this intelligence of one electron circulating around a few protons and neutrons that are sitting in one space, and that creates an element, and that element is carbon or whatever it is. This is the first chokhmah of Bria, and then that they cluster together, and then next thing you have something along the lines of a stone, or material, and then and the same thing with a tree, and then the nefesh, obviously, where there's life, that's a whole other thing that we're getting into. But every element, everything in this physical world that we think is real is just the intelligence of Bria holding it together. That's empty space. None of this, everything we're seeing right now is literally just empty space that's being held together in a physical form by this chokhmah in the Bria state. And by the time it gets down all these different levels, it feels real, like this looks real, and we can touch it and operate in it.
Okay. Okay, yeah.
Science. All the molecular structure of atoms.
Felt like I was in college again.
It's just a program.
Well, even yes. So
holding them together.
So exactly. So the intelligence that holds them together is one level below the intelligence of the atoms themselves.
There has to be a power too, not just a diagram.
Of course. But that's how can we? We've only gotten so far with science to dig so deep.
The power is Hashem, really.
Yeah, maybe the nefesh of the atom is, what I mean? If we talk about the power, that could be the nefesh of the atom that holds it together, and then the physical atom itself is in the Bria world.
How the sort of the source,
It's interesting. I'm just thinking what we were you bring a different dimension into it. Like we were talking about chokhmah in this world being the chokhmah that's floating around in the minds of men, right? Or inside the minds of an ant, let's say. Like, in other words, the chokhmah that one can perceive. But the reality is, there's another level of chokhmah, what you're saying, which is just like the chokhmah which is infused into the creation itself. That like you can call it like science, if you will, right? That things work in a certain way here. They're based on certain principles, and that principles is the chokhmah of it, right? So now think about this for a second. All that exciting concept that everything's just air and it's all like this sort of chokhmah, that's only in the physical world, right? So if you go up one world, it could be that the rules of the chokhmah, right? The whole chokhmah of the creation, how we understand atoms and subatomic particles, and that whole thing is like a sweetness of an apple compared to the real chokhmah, which is only one level up, right? That's a whole other way of getting excited about this.
And then one last piece on the chokhmah of the sweetness of the apple. So if you think of like the sweetness of, for example, apple cider versus the sweetness of the apple, or the sweetness of a cocoa bean versus the sweetness of ice cream, chocolate ice cream, it's a simple way to see one world down. If you see how each world gets distilled down, so the sweetness of a cocoa bean, for example, you've got the chokhmah of the cocoa bean that's all these levels up, and finally it manifests itself in this world as a cocoa bean. And if you take it one level down, the sweetness of chocolate ice cream has gone through from the sweetness of the cocoa bean, has filtered through the machsheva of the human mind, through the dibur and through the ma'aseh, one world down, and becomes chocolate ice cream. So it's just like you can see the human, taking it a world down even below the world above it.
Aval. Lios Antu Hakim. But in order to get to this situation of Antu Hakim, sorry, we gotta move on.
Please.
All right, Antu Hakim. So in other words, we're saying that Atzilus is the source of the source, right? Because as we just mentioned, Bria is our source, but Atzilus is the source of that source. We can't really call it our source. But Antu Hakim, in other words, but to get to a state where we go above that, where we're saying that you, which is the Orin Sof, are wise, right? In order to get to the state where Chokhmah becomes, where the Orin Sof fuses with Chokhmah and becomes called wise. Dahainu Amshachas Orin Sof b'Chokhmah, which is known as the drawing forth of the Orin Sof and making it Chokhmah. Hinia Chokhmah mamish me'ayin timatzeh. So this is already, we cannot call the Orin Sof the source even of Chokhmah. Right? We can call Bria the source of our Chokhmah. We can call Atzilus the source of our Chokhmah because it has, in some way, it can trace its lineage back to a previous place where it gets its energy from. But when you try and go one step beyond there, it doesn't work anymore. To say that the Orin Sof is the source of Chokhmah Atzilus, you can't say it. Because there's no trace of Chokhmah of Atzilus inside the Orin Sof. Right? It's what we call, that's the true notion of what we call yesh ma'ayin, something from nothing.
There's no Ein Sof in Chokhmah Atzilut?
There's no Ein Sof in Chokhmah Atzilus? We said that, remember we discussed it at great length. Some of the Orin Sof goes and becomes Chokhmah Atzilus, but what part? The foot of it, the external part of it, right? And even when it does, it really radically transforms itself from what it was before. To the point that you can't say that the thing that comes out was inside. You can say that the Chokhmah of Bria in some way was inside of Atzilus. You can say that the Chokhmah of Asiya was in some way inside of Bria. But you can't really say, in a normal sense, that the Chokhmah of Atzilus was inside of the Orin Sof, because there's not finite things inside of an infinite thing. It's not in there. Right? And therefore we say, Chokhmah me'ayin timatzeh. Chokhmah comes out of nothing. There's a concept of ex nihilo, right? With post facto, ex nihilo, right? Yeah, this, I don't know. We're going with what's his name?
Shlomo. Oh, ex nihilo.
No, just the way he translated the Tanya. The rabbi from Toronto passed away recently.
Oh,
Shochet. He speaks in very high terms like that. But anyway, ex nihilo means something from nothing, basically, right? And you have the idea that we can talk about the creation being something from nothing, right? That Bria is something from nothing. But the reality is that Bria is really not something from nothing. We just got through saying Bria has a source in Atzilus, right? So we call Bria something from nothing, but the true something from nothing is Atzilus from the Orin Sof. Because you can't find any trace of its root over there.
Is it disconnected?
It seems disconnected.
That's again the other portal. That's the other jumping spot where it goes from the light of the Orin Sof.
But it's not another
What?
portal. It's not just another portal.
Chokhmah Atzilus. Huh?
It's
Yeah.
beyond
Yep. Chokhmah mamish me'ayin timatzeh. V'lechein hi bechinas avanas nuso yisbarech. That's what we really, when we say this is the humbleness of Hashem. The place you'll find His greatness, where you can call Him Gadol or Chesed or Chokhmah, is really the place you find His unbelievable humility. Because He's basically removed Himself entirely from the situation in order to present you with that. Because He's not found inside of Him in any way. Alright, come, sit, relax. Ready?
How does that express something?
Shu Yerida Gedola Lefanav Yisbarach. It's an unbelievable descent for Hashem. What'd you say,
How
Yosef?
does that express in the lower words after Atzilus? I mean, even in Atzilus also, how can Ein Sof be expressed?
That's the point. It's really not. In other
It
words,
can,
what
but
you're
it's
expressing there.
It's connected there because there's still Ein Sof in every world. So how can?
No, Ein Sof in every world. You're already talking about something completely different. That's the Ein Sof in every world is completely makif and unexperienced by those worlds, right? In other words, it's not.
How can we tap into them?
That's another question. I mean, that's just a whole other question. I mean, I'm with you. It's a good question, but it's not really what's going on right now. But the point is that this is what's called the humility of Hashem, that He brings out this body of expression by removing Himself entirely. Because if any of Him was in there, it wouldn't look like Chesed, Chochma, Bina. It wouldn't look like any of these spheres. It would be one.
He removed him, but it's still him, the source. He's removing himself.
He removed himself, and he's showing you some thing, right, which is really only able to be there because of his removal. V'zeu lashon atzilus v'lashon hakodesh, and that's actually what the word atzilus means in lashon hakodesh. That's why it's called atzilus. Shu lashon yarida v'ashpala. It actually means to go down and to humble yourself. Mimidregaso elyona, from your higher level. Lashpiles atzmo keiluhu mimidrega pachusa. To lower yourself as if you're on another level. This is the word means. V'kamo, where do we see this? V'atzalti min haruach, right? Legabi Moshe. We find the word atzilus in the Chumash. Right? Moshe Rabbeinu says when he is bestowing his energy onto the 70 elders, okay, when at a certain point he says, I can't carry these people by myself, they're asking for meat, I don't know what to do with these people. Hashem says, put your shechina basically on the 70 elders. And the word that's used there is atzalti min haruach. I will etzilus, my spirit that's upon you, and put it upon them. So it means to go down a level, like infinitely down a level, to go from the level of Moshe Rabbeinu to a regular human being. Right? Dilafisha amar me'ayin li basar. And why did this have to happen? Because the people were saying we want meat. And this is kind of a funny thing, but Moshe Rabbeinu, you have to understand where Moshe Rabbeinu is hanging out, there's no we want meat. That just does not come into the possible realm of dimension of understanding of a Moshe Rabbeinu. He's in Devekas to the Orin Sof every single second. His machshava is connected with the machshava Hashem. His midos are connected with the midos of Hashem. His chokhmah bina das. He's just like an entity of pure divinity. And someone comes in the door and says, we're selling Girl Scout cookies. It's just not in there, So all the people are suddenly demanding meat. And he could not relate to them in any way whatsoever. So Hashem said, no worry. Take a little bit of your spirit and bring it down and put it on regular people who can relate to meat. And therefore there'll be some kind of an ability for you to experience what's lower than you. Because I agree with you, as you are, you're not in a dimension to experience physical needs. But your people are hungry. So you have to lower your spirit and basically bring it down a level so that the Moshe Rabbeinu light will descend into the 70 elders. And that's called the word atzalti. So we can see that's what the word atzilus actually means. It means to take your light and bring it down to a totally different dimension that you cannot possibly understand where you are right now. That's what the world of atzilus is. It's a descent into a completely different dimension. That's what the word means.
So is Hashem in atzilus? Because you said that for Hashem to be there, he had to remove himself.
He had to remove his infinite self.
Infinite.
And he basically presents some kind of finite version of himself, and that's a tremendous humility, because what is that? And he's still calling himself by that name, because he's saying, this is my chokhmah, this is my, what a humble thing to allow yourself, like we said the other day, to allow yourself, someone to call and say, wow, you're really rich, you got a golden, a silver dollar, when really you're like sitting on trillion dollars. It's a tremendous humility for someone to have the gall to call you, rich as a silver dollar holder, and for you to accept that, when in reality that's literally nothing of what you have. So it's a humility. Hashem allows himself to be called chokhmah. He allows himself to be called a silver dollar holder, when really you can only call him that when he removes his trillions of dollars.
So where was Moshe connected with Hashem? Hashem was in Atzilut. Where was Moshe? How did Moshe connect with Hashem? At what level?
Really, the essential level. The essential level. All right.
Is Bitul at all related to Atzilut, like kind of like comparable to our own Bitul, to Hashem's humility to lower himself or to remove himself from?
The spheros of Atzilus have to be in a state of 100% bitul in order to experience inside of them what Hashem is trying to put there. So that's where you have to say, bitul is like the definition of the world of Atzilus, but not because Hashem is having bitul, because that body is having a 100% bitul in order to experience even this, what we're now calling a tiny ray of nothing that's going into them. It's still some fraction of the Orin Sof. So for that to be able to be held in them, they have to be in a state of moving their identity out of the way 100%.
Oh,
to
sorry.
experience that. So the bittul is found by the spheres of Atzilut, not by Hashem. But also he's humbling himself, which is I guess some type of bittul. He's removing all of his light to go in there. So you.
I just have another physical one for this. Like the removal of the light of Hashem, it's so overwhelming. Like the silver dollar to the $1 trillion, the light of Hashem is so intense that like we think of the sun as so bright, but we wouldn't even be able to see the sun or recognize the sun with the light of Hashem. So Hashem has to remove himself even from the spheres of space so that we can even see the sun. Just as the sun has to remove itself at night so we can even see the stars.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. Exactly. Shu Yerida Gadol Lefanav. There's a tremendous descent. V'zeu Lashon Atzilus. We just said all that, right? And Moshe was coming from the level of Ma'ayin Li Basar. Where am I going to get meat? So all of a sudden, Sha'isa Midregasu b'Mayil Elyona, because his level was so high. V'lo hayachol lashpilas atzmim b'hamshachas basar gashmi. He couldn't bring himself down to a state of physical meat. In other words, let me put this another way. I'm going to introduce just something wild. What does it mean Moshe couldn't bring himself down to a state of physical meat? So we see something hinted to in here, but it's broadly explained elsewhere, that we think of Moshe Rabbeinu as a teacher, as a great man, and this goes also for the Moshe Rabbeinu in every generation. Someone you have to look up to, someone you can emulate. Really, Moshe Rabbeinu is a sort of level of divinity. And he's the level of divinity, you were asking, like, what level is he connected on? He's the level of divinity who is responsible for bringing all the energy into this world, physical, spiritual, and otherwise, at every second. If he's not here, there's no world. As it says, Tzaddik Yesod Olam. The Tzaddik is literally the foundation of the world. He's not what you think he is. He's some kind of a conduit of divine energy to enter into this space. In other words, he is the channel to bring all divine energy into the physical world. And that's why it was important for Moshe Rabbeinu to bestow his energy onto the 70 elders. Because the level of energy that he was bringing into the world at that time could not recognize physical desire. So he was giving them Yetzias Mitzrayim, he was giving them Kriyas Yamsuf, he was giving them Torah, he was giving them wisdom, he was making them into like the world that he was distributing to the Jewish people was a world of like angels basically. And so all of a sudden they're like, by the way, like we wouldn't mind a little snack, you know what I'm saying? So basically he couldn't do it though. The level that he was basically sorry, that's not the best word. But the level that he was summoning, it was too high to connect physical desires with this world. So he had to come down a level, bestow his energy onto the 70 elders, so that this enlivening energy could come down to the level of meat. And that's why he says he couldn't ma'ayin li basar. Why are you asking? Where do you have to come up with meat? Moses, let Hashem come up with the meat. So you're seeing from here is that Hashem's distribution of energy into the world comes through Moshe Rabbeinu. He's the source of life. You know, so his kashrus with the Rebbe, connecting yourself with the Moses of the generation, is not like an optional, good idea if you want to be like, a spitz chabadnik. This is like this, and this is all, parent base of Tanya. This is not. This is real stuff. He literally, your life is a part of his soul. So in other words, connecting to yourself to him is like connecting yourself to the heart, so that the blood flows to you. So if you're not in line with him, you're having less shefa come into you spiritually and materially. So right. So the idea here is that Moshe was saying, okay, if you want me to give them meat, if you want me to join with them at that level, you have to bring me down a notch. My dials don't go to meat. L'chach amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Therefore Hashem said to Moshe, Espali shivim ish, gather 70 men for me. And what is shivim ish? By the way, the 70 men represents the Seder Ishtoshtus. The 70 is the 7 lower midos, right? So that's why Moshe was like in a state of chokhmah. He couldn't come down that low. The midos is the worldly, right? The world is created in 7 days. The 7 attributes are more connected to down here. So therefore he had to come and join himself to the 70 midos. And that's why there was dafka 70 men. Shehem b'medrega pachusa. They're in the lower level. Hainu shelo misgashmi mamish.
7 or 70?
70,
but it's 7 times 10.
Yeah.
Right, because each
one has 10.
sephira has 10 within it.
What?
There's 70 midos or 7 midos?
There's 7 and each one has 10. So there's 70 altogether.
70 nations, so each nation has a set sphere?
Each nation is one particular aspect of the Hishtoshlus, yeah. They've divided themselves into, 200 some nations at this point, but they can't hide. They're all in there, 70 somewhere. Right? So in other words, what happened is that Moshe didn't have to come down so low. He sort of stayed where he was. He just lowered himself onto these other people and placed his spirit upon them. So he sort of stayed in his place, but he lowered his spirit onto a lower dimension. So Hashem is saying, I will diminish, lower, and draw down your level, so your level will be holding on a level lower than you. Moshe stayed where he was, but he's going to sort of, light the candle of Moshe on this lower plane. V'samti aleim, and I'm going to place it upon them, sheyanika gam lehem and so they themselves, on their level, can have some nourishment from the level of Moshe Rabbeinu. But not that they went up to Moshe's level. That's not what happened. Right? They're still in a completely different dimension. It's just that a little bit of Moshe's level can come nourishing down and touch into them. And let's just finish the point. Kamo kain lamayla inyan Atzilus. Now, all that was an analogy to learn the word Atzilus. That's called Atzilus, to come down from Moshe to the others. Atzalti min ruach. So too, the world of Atzilus. Bechinas Yerida. The whole thing, it means to come down to a level which is not your level anymore. To allow a lower level to suckle and nourish from a higher level, yes. Lios hislabshus Orin Sof b'chokhmah. And what is it? So that the Orin Sof can be invested into chokhmah. Does the chokhmah come onto the level of the Orin Sof? Just like the 70 elders did not become Moshe Rabbeinu? No. It's just that the Orin Sof is like dripping in. And they can nourish and suckle from that level of the Orin Sof. So too chokhmah can now have a certain bechina of the Orin Sof inside of it. And that's why we call these 10 spheros the tikkunim, as we said. Shem bechinas levushin, it means to dress up the Orin Sof, velo atzmius, but it's not the essence of the Orin Sof. That's what we're saying. Ultimately, chokhmah ma'ayin timatzah. It still comes out from nothing. It's not the Orin Sof. It's just a dressed up, sort of suckling version of the Orin Sof, exiting the Orin Sof and allowing a lower dimension to suckle from it. Mikom makom, nevertheless, einu levushin mamish. They're not actual levushin like the lower three worlds, ela tikkunin, but rather they're called tikkunin, a higher version of the word levush, mishum de'iu v'garmu yichad, because now we're going to flip it the other way, because there's still something very, very, very godly about these things. Because it's basically Moshe Rabbeinu's light on the elders. You know, the elders were not just merely elders anymore. They were now elders who had the spirit of Moshe inside of them. So it's basically what we're trying to go is back and forth between how they're mamish, not the Orin Sof, and how actually they are the Orin Sof. And why is he driving us crazy? Because this is the ultimate, as we said a few days ago, this is the ultimate purpose to understand everything, how divinity manifests itself at a finite level. And you don't want to get confused and think that the finite level is divinity. But then you also don't want to get confused and think that the finite level is not divinity. Right? Because it's this wondrous fusion of things, that Hashem becomes one with his vessels, like a body is one with the soul. But what? It's not the actual essence of the soul, it's just the external part of the soul, but nonetheless it becomes one. Masha'en kain biyah, which is not so in the world of Bria Tzir Nasiya. They do not have this quality of being one with the soul. They're merely like garments which attach themselves externally to this body of Hashem. Okay.
That was also the answer for the Gemara, why Rabbi is choosing another perspective.